It is July 24th, 2024, and suddenly Kiev's officials want to talk about peace with Russia. No, I'm not making that up. You have Ukraine's foreign minister in Beijing, which, as we know, China has long tried to be a mediator in the ongoing conflict. They've wanted and pushed for peace. So Kiev sends their foreign minister to Beijing. He says that Ukraine is ready for peace talks with Russia. And you've also got Zelensky making similar claims, saying, hey, we're ready for peace. But as we know, any sort of peace would come at a price, because this is not the first time that Russia has been through it with Kiev. Well, the Western backed Kiev more specifically. It's not the first time that they have attempted to extend an olive branch. We saw this with the Minsk agreements. We saw this with the Istanbul talks. Time and time, not only has Russia tried to pursue peace, but the West, on their end, has used Russia's willingness to negotiate to try to exploit them at the end of the day, to just buy more time so that they could continue to arm Kiev. We know that Moscow has learned from all of this, and they are in a very different position right now as they continue to make advances on the battlefield, serving as a reminder that Kiev isn't exactly in a place to be demanding too much this time around. But how much will they actually ask for, and could we see peace talks? We discussed all that and more earlier with a special guest, so let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Diesen, a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia and Global Affairs. Professor Diesen, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, because it seems that, after backing out of the Istanbul talks back in 2022 and referring to working with Russia in any way as something that would be impossible on their end, Kiev's leaders are now suddenly talking about peace. You've got Zelensky telling a Vatican official, quote, "We have to finish the war as soon as possible, of course, not to lose people's lives." Seems like it's a little late for that. And Ukraine's foreign minister is telling his Chinese counterpart that Kiev is ready for peace talks with Moscow. What do you make of this latest rhetoric? Do you buy that it's actually truthful?
Well, it is the possibility, of course, that is Zelensky and all the wider political class in Kiev are not sincere. I, however, suspect that they are, simply because we have more or less reached the end of the line. They have a massive shortage of manpower, shortage of weaponry, and irrespective of how much money is thrown at them, you can't simply rebuild an army, even if it wasn't very corrupt. At the moment, the Russians dominate in the air, so they can use these glide bombs, which just smash through the Ukrainian defenses. So they're taking just horrific casualties now on the Ukrainian side. So I think it's time for negotiations. And as you mentioned as well, it's worth going back to the Istanbul agreement, because keep in mind that when the Russians invaded in February of 2022, they contacted Zelensky, as Zelensky himself confirmed, on the first day of the invasion to start negotiations. So the purpose was simply, after 7 years of failing to implement the Minsk agreement, the Russians wanted to use, the military to force a peace on the Ukrainians. And but this is when the United States and the United Kingdom intervened in the negotiations, because both the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the negotiators recognized they were close to a peace. But the US and UK, they, at this point in time, sabotaged the peace agreement. So what they offered Zelensky is, if they turn down the peace agreement and instead fight, so choose war, then they would get all the weapons they would need to fight the Russians. Well, and that was the deal. But as I said, now we reached the end of the line. The Ukrainians are exhausted. And furthermore, when now we have huge political changes coming to the United States, which suggests there will be much less willingness to pour more money and weaponry into this war.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see how much things have changed even in just 2 years. As you were pointing out there, you have Kiev's officials in a place now where they're likely looking around and going, okay, we have these manpower shortages that aren't going to be solved easily unless NATO starts sending some troops in. And then you have these weapon shortages that aren't really being tackled at all because you've got NATO kind of keeping Kiev on life support. And just the fact that Ukraine's foreign minister is currently in China. I mean, I know that Beijing has kind of been seen as a country that if we are going to have a mediator for talks, they would be the likely country. How do you see that visit, and how do you think that Beijing sees it, especially given the fact that they've been trying to present some kind of, hey, let's get together for peace talks, let's consider an agreement since almost the very beginning here?
Well, it's worth opening up by saying that the Chinese have been pushing peace agreements everywhere between the Saudis, the Iranians, now between the two factions in Palestine, that is between the West Bank and Gaza. So, and also when it comes to Ukraine, they would like to see peace. They have very little to gain from this conflict. So, but I think we've in the West been too quick to dismiss the Chinese. Some Europeans like Macron, they went to China and they suggested, China should help us to put an end to the war. But the Europeans and Americans don't want to negotiate with the Russians. They don't even want any basic diplomacy with the Russians. So what they effectively ask for the Chinese is to put pressure on Russia to effectively force Russia to capitulate. But this is not something the Chinese want, of course. They don't want the Russians defeated because, there's so many American leaders now have been stating the obvious that once they've been able to defeat Russia, they could move on to China. So, why would the Chinese assist in their own destruction? So they're not going to help the West defeat Russia, but they will help to bring a peace to this conflict. And it's also worth noting that China doesn't only represent China. The position it takes tend to reflect that of the global South, which is also the global majority. So I think it's a good negotiator to start things off, I think.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to me. I know that every time you have Beijing in a position of getting two sides to come to a peace agreement, as we saw with Iran and Saudi Arabia, the US seems to get frustrated, right? The US government, they don't want to talk about why they're not involved in that. But it's like, yeah, this could be the US if you were not exporting war everywhere and going for one conquest after another. You could be the side that was helping to repair some of these, decades long rivalries. And when it comes back to where Russia stands and how they see all of this, I'm always curious too, because obviously, as we were talking about, Russia has been through it, right? They've been through the Minsk agreements, they've been through the Istanbul talks. At every turn, they have tried to say, hey, let's come to some sort of an agreement, let's avoid an all out war. And yet, not only has the West used this to basically buy time, but as we've seen with the Minsk agreements, they've used this to try to exploit Russia as if wanting peace is a bad thing here. And so, given the current situation that we're in, where you do have Russia advancing on the battlefield, how do you think that they see the possibility of peace talks, of coming to some sort of an agreement, especially with that concern that Kiev and the West could just try to use it to buy more time?
Well, this is the huge distrust now Russia has of the West, because we have to be honest, we have broken almost every single agreement we ever made with the Russians over the past 30 years, from constructing an inclusive European security architecture to, of course, the crisis in Ukraine. It's even worth going back to 2013 and 14 when the West was destabilizing and ahead of the coup in Ukraine. And at this point in time, the West was able to force President Yanukovych to form a unity government in Minsk. No, sorry, in Kiev. But then, the Europeans signed under as guarantors. But within the next 24 hours, they toppled Yanukovych. And instead of going and insisting on abiding by the unity government, the Europeans flew all the top officials to Ukraine to effectively give legitimacy to the coup, as well as the United States, of course, recognized the legitimacy of the coup government within the first 24 hours. So we broke that agreement. And then, of course, that sparked a civil war, which was resolved by the Minsk agreement in February of 2015, that is Minsk II. And then for 7 years, we sabotaged that peace agreement. It's been said very openly. the main two negotiators who made the agreement was the French and the Germans, and they have come out later and said that there was no intentions of implementing the agreement. What they wanted to do is buy time to arm Ukraine. And that's the rhetoric you saw in 2021 as well, when the Russians were saying, why aren't you implementing Minsk agreement? And well, more or less the response was, well, that reflected the realities in 2015. Look at the realities now. We built a powerful Ukrainian army. We should follow the spirit of Minsk, which is what we say when we want to undermine the agreement. So now, of course, the Russians invaded to push force through their preferable peace settlement, if you will. And, we very openly sabotaged that as well, because as the Israelis and the Turks recognized, this was an opportunity for the US, the UK, and NATO to kill the Russians. That is, to weaken a strategic adversary without using their own troops. They could fight with Ukrainians. And but 2.5 years into it, we're losing this, and now we're going to go back to the Russians and find a peace agreement. If you were advising Moscow, what would you say? You would probably say, well, you should be cautious. The West is only looking to buy time. They would like to put a ceasefire in place so we can rebuild the Ukrainian army and fight another day. And and this is what we're stating quite obvious as well. This is what the analysts are saying in the different journals and the media, that this is just a ceasefire. We need time to, time is not on our side. We have to buy some time to get more weaponry, ammunition, and arm Ukraine. So I don't see why the Russians should trust us this time, and this is problematic. And the Russians are also signaling very clearly they do not want any temporary settlements, and so we can fight it again tomorrow. They would like not a ceasefire, but they would want actual peace settlement in which both sides agree on something. This could be a positive thing, because if they would like to have our acceptance of a settlement, that means they will have to be able to show some willingness to make some concessions as well. But that means on our end, we also will have to make some concessions and also actually put an end to this conflict. That means no more using Ukrainians to fight Russian. So
Yeah, I think that it definitely is one of those things where it'll be. I'm always curious to see, of course, how Russia views this. And as you laid out there, I mean, we're in a situation where we've been through this. It's not as if this conflict came out of nowhere. It's not as if there haven't been a number of attempts by Russia over the years to try to settle things. And going back to history, I think, is also important when you look at someone like Zelensky and the fact that he campaigned on peace with Russia back in 2019, and then he met the violent neo-Nazis within his country. And it just makes me wonder, let's say that Russia says, okay, we need a settlement, right? Here are our terms. Zelensky says, you know what, we're going to meet those terms. His Western backers say, okay, that's great. Is there still some concern about those violent neo-Nazi factions within Ukraine, especially now that, you look at the Azov Brigade, they've been elevated within the military. They're not just some sort of random offshoot groups. No, these are ones who still have a lot of pull within Ukrainian society. Could you see them pushing back against this, even though at this point I can imagine Kiev's officials are kind of going, okay, we need to agree to something now because it doesn't get better from here?
yeah, I think definitely if there's an effort to make peace by Zelensky now, the different far right and Nazi groups will definitely turn on him. And this has been one of the purposes of the NATO countries allying themselves with these Nazi groups. Now, the problem in the West is we're not allowed to refer to them as Nazis effectively, because we dismiss it as simply Russian propaganda, even though the evidence is overwhelming and we recognize these fascist groups as well. Indeed, one of the reasons why the US had restrictions on arming Azov in the past, which they removed now, was because they were recognized to be Nazis. So, what made them a very powerful ally is that they effectively functioned as a veto power in Ukraine for anyone who would want to make peace with the Russians. Keep in mind that during the coup in 2014, these Nazi groups were the spearhead, which really brought the violence to Kiev. and to the Maidan. And then once the coup had been made, we had a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who didn't want to go to Donbass to kill their own citizens who refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new government. So that's when they relied again on these fascist groups as well to go fight the people in Donbass. And once Poroshenko came to power as well, he also wanted to implement the Minsk agreement. Even Parliament voted in favor of it. However, this didn't really matter because that's when the violence of the fascists increased against their own government, and they had to reverse themselves. So Poroshenko became then aligned with the Nazi groups. Then came, of course, Zelensky. He won this huge victory in 2019. He got 73% of the vote. And his main platform was one of peace. So peace with Donbass, peace with Russia. And this meant implementing the Minsk agreement. And also basic stuff like recognizing cultural rights and language rights of the Russian speakers in the East. So, but again, as you mentioned, the Nazis yet again were used as a veto power because they effectively threatened to kill Zelensky. Several of the Nazi leaders threatened to kill Zelensky. You would think they would end up in prison, but instead they all received top positions in his government, and they were integrated not just to be some militia, but as you said, part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So this was a conscious decision that it was better to align with them as they had a lot of power. And this is what continues to this day to be a huge problem. So unless the Azov and these groups are severely weakened on the battlefield, they will have still combat strength, which means they will have a lot of influence in Kiev. So unless there's a spectacular defeat on the front lines, I can't imagine them accepting any peace negotiations with Russia.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely good to keep in mind. And of course, if there's anything we've learned about the United States and its proxy wars, it always goes for the extremist, right? It always aligns itself with the worst people in order to carry out, whether it be a government overthrow or something of the sort, to really sow chaos in the region. And I thought it was interesting. There's a recent poll that was conducted by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, and it found that 32% of respondents said that they believe that for the sake of achieving peace as soon as possible and preserving its independence, Ukraine should relinquish some of its territory. Now, that's compared to just 10% who were asked the same question back in May 2023. And I know that it's not a majority, but it is interesting to me when we look at the current situation, because Zelensky has been so intent on claiming that they are going to get back control of not just the entire Donbass region, but also of Crimea. How do you see the current situation and this focus on territory coming from, whether it be Zelensky, those neo-Nazi factions, but clearly that focus is not what is leading them to being in the winning position right now?
Yeah, well, I think the shift in opinion polls, it's merely reflects how the battlefield has changed. And there's a comment, frequent comments made by Zelensky's former advisor, Alexei Arestovich, and he keeps making the point that the Ukrainians still are consumed by propaganda. Keep in mind that in Ukraine now, Zelensky controls all the media, which means that they've been fed every day the story: we're winning. Ukraine has taken a lot of casualties. However, the Russian casualties are much higher. It's not that different from what we get fed here in the West. At least in Europe now, we still many of the media still arguing that the Russians are suffering much more than the Ukrainians, which doesn't really make sense. If you look at the artillery advantage, the Russians have the air superiority, the drone advantage. They're dominating in all areas, and nonetheless, we're pretending as if they're taking the high casualties. So nothing really makes sense. But if the propaganda is working here, it's also working in Ukraine. So what the argument of Arestovich was, it's very difficult to turn this train because we've been pushing the propaganda so hard for so long, which then extend the break length, if you will, on the propaganda. How can you shift the narrative from we're winning to it's all over, we're collapsing, we need to make a peace now. And they do need to make a peace now. And it's not as if the option is between either make a settlement on territory now or make no settlement. It's either a limited compromise now or a huge compromise in the future, because the Ukrainians are worn out, and the Russians will take more and more territory. I fail to see where the argument is that if they will only lose more territory every day, more manpower every day, they can't possibly win. Why wouldn't you make a deal today if it's going to be better than the deal you get tomorrow? So I think this is what they have to do. But this war has many dimensions, as you mentioned. You have public opinion, which has been propagandized. You have Zelensky, and then you have the fascist groups. You have a lot of people in the army who feels like Zelensky been used by the West, and especially by the Americans. You have the United States, which might not really want to end the war altogether, but maybe be able to use the Ukrainians in the future as well to create some problems for the Russians. So there's a lot of different moving parts or different actors with different interests. So it's going to be very difficult. And in addition, the Russian demands as well, they are harsh. They have laid claim to a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory. Some of this territory they're not even controlling yet. So it's going to be a very difficult pill to swallow. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to kind of keep in mind too, especially when we talk about the public in Ukraine. If you've been constantly told we're winning, and you believe that, then hearing any sort of, oh, okay, we need to pursue peace talks now, you're going to be going, what? But we're doing so well, right? We're the ones who are on top here. Why would we stoop down to that level? And now I'm also curious, lastly, I wanted to ask you about the current.
Can I just one one quick comment? Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make the comparison here, because keep in mind with Afghanistan, this was our news as well. For 20 years, we got the news. We're winning. And then suddenly we're running away with people falling off airplanes. And then we're told, oh yeah, no, there's actually all these documents which prove that we knew that we were losing, but we had to keep up a public support for the war. So we told everyone we're winning. So we tend to do this every time, and with every new war, we have to pretend as if our governments are always honest with us, that the media somehow only have spread this objective reality. So. Anyway, so sorry for interrupting.
No, you're good. I'm glad that you bring that up, because I remember several years ago now, but when the Afghanistan papers came out and they were published by the Washington Post at the time, that was one of the things, that was the big thing that they mentioned was, look, you talk to all of these generals and they're admitting that this claim that for, 20 years, the US was saying, oh, we're so close to winning the war in Afghanistan, that was never true. And on top of that, they never really had an actual end goal, which is another issue that the West runs into, right? They're all fine and good to go in and to overthrow a government or to completely impact a country with their military and with an invasion. But then they look at it and they go, oh, wait a second, where do we go from here? Now, the last thing that I did want to ask you about, because I know that, being in Europe and being in a position of kind of watching the way that the West has conducted this propaganda campaign of endless support, as they say, for as long as it takes for Ukraine. And then watching what's happening in the US right now, where you have Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 race. You have Donald Trump claiming that he's going to, fix everything in 24 hours and end the war. You have Kamala Harris, who I don't really know what her plan is. I don't know that she knows what her plan is. What does that look like from your perspective? And is there a little bit of concern, especially in Europe, thinking, okay, if the US pulls out of this, anything similar to what they did to Afghanistan, that's going to put a lot of pressure on the EU and the UK to then bear the brunt of it and to continue supporting Kiev if they choose to?
Well, it's been an interesting shift in Europe, because if you go back to 2008, when Bush wanted to promise Ukraine future NATO membership. The French, the Germans, well, overall the Europeans were very much against it because, as Angela Merkel back then said, the Russians would interpret this as a declaration of war. Even Robert Gates, William Burns in the United States, all these people also warned that Russia sees this as an existential threat. They will react very negatively. So, but nonetheless, the Europeans tried. They really didn't want the Americans to push, but eventually they had to fold because, we're very dependent on the United States. But now it's of course shifted. Now, we bought into our own propaganda. If you suggest that Russia considers this to be an existential threat, it's dismissed as Russian propaganda, even though all our politicians have confirmed this, since the 90s. Well, not all, but a huge part of the top politicians. And now, of course, the mood in Europe is. Well, if you want to look at the most media and politicians, it's a bit of a combination of New York Times and CNN. I think that's a good copy paste. So for us, Joe Biden was a savior, an extension of Obama. So, and all our media is now also building up Kamala Harris as being, this great leader who, well, if not great, at least someone who will save us from Trump. But I think there's going to be huge shifts or problems. I have a hard time believing that Kamala Harris can actually win this. For water policies, I think she will probably be a continuation of Biden to a large extent. She won't change much on Ukraine. They kind of have a common platform. On the other hand, it's worth noting that Biden has been very closely linked to the Ukraine project for more than a decade. Ever since the coup, he had a very central role when the United States established very close control over the Ukrainian government. As general prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, argued, the U.S. was, they had to decide all appointments for the Ukrainian governments, and he's argued that the Americans were running Ukraine like a colony. And it's worth noting that Biden himself personally took credit for getting the general prosecutor of Ukraine fired, and even put his son in, one of the gas companies. And anyways, so on one hand, you can say that Biden is linked closer to Project Ukraine, but I can't imagine Kamala Harris taking much of a different pathway. On the other hand, Trump, especially now with Vance selected as his VP, I think it's very clear that they are preparing to, get rid of this problem of Ukraine. And they do see it as a problem now. It's a war that can't be won. It's draining them of resources. It's pushing their main adversaries together. It's simply not a strategic way to go. And for all the irrationality you often see in American politics, at least there's some rationality there. Some compared to the Europeans, at least, we've really dug into the whole ideology that this is a great struggle between good and evil, liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. So, we can't refer to security competition or, the idea of putting a hostile military alliance on Russia's border. Perhaps this could be a problem. None of this. It's all ideology now. So at least from the United States, we do see some pragmatism and some willingness to change course, possibly. So I think the Europeans are looking towards the US and the political shifts or changes taking place. But in my opinion, we're betting on the wrong horse. I mean, for all of his mistakes, I think Trump is the only one who's actually suggesting peace now with Russia, which is what everyone needs.
Yeah, I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and a lot to keep an eye on as we get closer to that election and see, of course, how it impacts foreign policy overall, or if it does have an impact on it. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down the latest here. Glenn Diesen, a professor at the University of South-Eastern Norway and an associate editor at the journal Russia and Global Affairs. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank you all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.